Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very important conversation about addressing burnout in the workplace and figuring out how we as an organization can create a more sustainable path for employee well-being. With that, my name is Nusrat Sharif, and I lead the Middle East consulting practice for International SOS. But before we start this session, I would first like to thank both Siham Laziz from Workplace Options as well as Lorraine Manoj from International SOS for pulling this session together. And I'm sure, as most of you know, Workplace Options is a provider of integrated employee well-being services to millions of people across 200 countries and territories. And they've been doing this for over 40 years, enhancing employee wellness through a wide range of emotional and physical support solutions. International SOS, on the other hand, has been in the business of saving lives and protecting global workforce for health and security threats for 40 years as well. And we've delivered customized health, security, risk management, and well-being solutions that support organizations' growth and productivity. And we've been providing this support and assistance for over 1,200 locations in 90 countries. So both of you, thank you for this session and bringing these two organizations together that have been in partnership since 2015. And the second sort of point I want to make, which is on housekeeping, before we jump into our session, is a reminder that your sound will be on mute throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A chat box, which you'll be able to probably see on your webinar panel as well. We will be recording this webinar session for your convenience, and we'll share the resources at the end of the session as well. So with the formalities aside, let's dive deep into one of the most pressing, I think, issues affecting workplace around the globe, and especially in the Middle East, which is burnout. I'm sure everyone's heard the terminology burnout, stress, mental health. These almost sound like buzzwords, but I think burnout is more than just a buzzword. It is a really critical issue that can impact an individual's mental health, physical health, in turn their productivity, as well as even the success of an organization. So as individuals, as we navigate the high pressure environments, especially post-pandemic, I think we feel that pandemic was years ago, which is true, but then the repercussions of what happened during the pandemic and post-pandemic has been pretty immense, and you can see that sort of filtered through, especially we were working from home. Then it was the hybrid work model. Then there was international sort of assignments were becoming the norm. And to top all of this, especially in the region, this is the devastating crisis in this particular region that they've been privy to. It is really essential, while we keep all of this in mind, to then understand burnout from both an individual as well as an organizational perspective. With this discussion today, we are not only going to look to define and differentiate workout, stress and burnout, but we're also going to explore strategies to cope with and prevent burnout. What's special, with a special focus on, of course, the cultural and the regional factors. For that, we have a fantastic panel of experts today with us who will guide us through that discussion and provide insights into both individual and organizational responsibilities that they have to manage burnout. I think that's really key. So I'm going to start to my left. I have Dr. Rodrigo Rodriguez Fernandez, Global Health Advisor, Wellness and Mental Health at International SOS. And on my right, I have Issam Shirkawi, who's the Vice President of Clinical Services Delivery, EMEA, at WPO. So thank you both. Thank you for taking the time. It's really good to have both of you on this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. It's a bit of a personal task for me to understand what burnout is, because it's been talked about so much. So what I would like to do is, let's start with the basics of understanding what burnout truly means and how it differs from everyday stress. And I think that's a struggle for a lot of people to sort of understand when does stress end and when are you sort of moving into that burnout phase. So I'll start with you, Rod. If you can help with what is the meaning of burnout in medical terms, but how does that translate into layman's terms? Is it a medical term to start with? And then the difference between burnout and stress.
Yeah, thanks, Nusrat. So So burnout is something in medicine we call a syndrome. So a syndrome in medicine is when you have a group of signs or symptoms that when an individual has those signs or symptoms and has all of them, then they classify as having uh, a syndrome that's been well defined. So this is a relatively new syndrome. It was defined by WHO. I mean, not too long ago, really. It was a few years ago, to be honest. And it was included in what we call the ICD 11, or the International Classification of Disease. So it is using that same nomenclature that we use in medicine to define diseases or conditions. And essentially, it is a syndrome that if you have these three things, you can safely say that somebody has burnout. So those three elements of that syndrome are A, feeling a depletion of energy or feeling exhausted, B, having increased mental distance from your job or feeling negative or cynical about your job, and then three, reduced professional efficacy, so being less efficient on the job. So as you can see, they're very, very specific concepts, and if you have those three, then you can, safely say that somebody is very likely to have burnout. Now, the way we actually measure from a numerical perspective in a workplace if somebody has it is we have these tools where they're essentially surveys. There's different what we call instruments, which essentially is another way to say survey, where you can answer a few questions, and depending on your score, you can actually get a number to know if you have burnout or not. So these tools are free to use. They're open access. So if anybody's interested, you can go on Google and look at the Maslach burnout inventory or burnout scales and answer a few of those questions. Now, stress, on the other hand, is not a medical term. It is a concept that we actually use in physics, in economy, and econometrics, and in sports. And it's anytime you have sort of a pressure applied or a strain to an object. So in this case, a stressor is something that's causing a strain or making the individual's emotional state sort of work harder than its baseline. So those are the two sort of main differences, from a medical perspective.
Great. Thanks, Rod. That's really helpful. I think to classify that stress is not a medical term, but it's more of it leads to burnout, which could now is defined in the medical terminology, which is great to know. But so that just leads to the next question: is once an individual has identified them to be on the cusp of burnout or are already feeling that burnout in them, what are the strategies an individual can use to cope with to recover from burnout? Is it recoverable? And I'll pose that question to Issam because I know Issam, WPO sort of deals with a lot of employees and individuals on an individual basis, and that you sort of probably come across. So would love to get your thoughts on that, and then I'll hand it over to Rod as well to get his perspective.
Thank you, Nusrat. Good news is it is recoverable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today talking about it and how to cope with it. So we can all recover from burnout, thankfully. I think that's a good question. And I think for burnout, but actually for any other triggering event from an emotional state perspective, I think we have to go through these 3 steps of analyzing what's happening, where I am at, what are the symptoms. Then we would have the second stage, which is intervening. Let's intervene, implement strategies to try and cope with it. And the third step would be assessing the efficiency or the impact of the intervention we have implemented. In burnout, I think the first phase is highly important because just as you mentioned in your question, there are several stages of burnout. Now, unfortunately, I don't think there is a common consensus about how many stages there are. If you actually do some research, some people talk about 3 stages of burnout. Some people mention 5 stages of burnout. Some people mention 7 stages of burnout. But I think the common part among all these classifications is having what we call a pre-burnout state, where you start recognizing the symptoms, you start feeling a difference in your professional, emotional, social life. The other phase is the actual burnout. You are going through a burnout, and the third phase, or the final phase, or the final stage would be the recovering from burnout. So I think the symptoms that we would use in the first stage of pre-burnout might differ from the interventions we might have being in a burnout or recovering from a burnout. So trying to put everything in the same basket, and coming back to what Rodri has mentioned in terms of the different symptoms being physical, emotional, professional, I think there's a vicious circle between our physical state and emotional state. Um, if there is an alteration of your sleeping patterns, of a lack of appetite, this will impact your emotional state, which on the other hand will actually have a negative impact on your physical state, for example. So the idea is to target what are the symptoms that I am the most struggling with. Is it the exhaustion piece that Roger has mentioned? Is it the lack of sleep or appetite? Is it the lack of value at the workplace? And depending on the symptoms that we are feeling and that actually differ from what we consider as our normal state, even though it's tricky to define what is normal, that's where we would implement, whether it's improving sleep patterns, whether it's having some mindfulness exercises, whether it's having some increased social activity, whether it's actually purely professional, speaking with your manager. And we will go further into details toward the end of the webinar, but I think it's all about identifying what stage we're in, what are the main symptoms that I struggle with and I want to cope with, and what can I implement. The last comment before I move on to Rodri is really, I think the pre-burnout phase is appropriate for personal individual interventions. You can try and improve your own state by improving your sleep, by doing some physical exercise, speaking to your manager, seeking peer-to-peer support, speaking with family members. And I know that in the Middle East, the family has its own weight in this situation. The further we go in burnout, the more professional support is going to be required and necessary. So I think that the first step is trying to implement self-care strategies, actually, whereas the further we go, we might want to seek professional support, both medical and psychological, which is meeting with your doctor and then getting psychological support when required.
And that's helpful, Sam. Thank you. And you mentioned this, right? From a cultural perspective, at least in the Middle East, you have that family support, and everyone's very sort of use that as their support system as well. But at the same time, especially in the region or in other regions as well, the concept is very new. The concept is also not well received, almost sort of goes to the borderline of mental health. The terminology mental health is still taboo. Um, so how do we as I as an individual, for example, and I struggle with this sometimes as well, is help myself support, because I know I'm exhausted, but what is it that we can do and put in place? What is it that I can do and put in place to make sure that, to take a step back and make sure I review that? So are there any steps and strategy that I can implement personally to address the sleeping pattern, to address the exhaustion, to actually come to terms with the fact that yes, I am probably leading to that burnout phase. But Rod, your thoughts on that particular topic?
Yeah, so there definitely are things that we can do. I think going back to what Isam mentioned, it's important to remember two things. So one, as he alluded to, the physical and mental, connectedness is undeniable. So we have a tendency in especially in the West to remove the head from the body. But if you look at medicine in the East, it's very integral. You can't separate both of them. And so we have to think that the second important thing to remember is that it's not a linear process, but it's very dynamic in the sense that you don't go from A to B and C and that's it, and you try to manage it medically from taking it back from C to B to A. It's not that simple. We have ups and downs, ebbs and flows of emotional state. We can be in, C, which is the most high risk, and then fluctuate to B, and then go back and forth. So we have to remember that it's a really dynamic process. And depending on, as Isam said, where you are, you will see different medical manifestations of it. Now, unfortunately, when you get to the very end, when you're at the C, at the high risk piece, it starts to manifest itself not as an emotional state, but it actually goes into the physical elements. So you can see people start to develop cardiovascular symptoms. You see people start to, as we mentioned, lose appetite, which will then affect their immune system, which then can lead to, let's say, skin diseases or skin manifestations. So there's a whole range of ways that it can show its head. And very similar to other chronic diseases, or as we call them, non-communicable diseases, which mental health is one of them, they're what we call sort of silent conditions. So many times you have no idea you have them until you've had them for 20 years and they manifest themselves as a physical ailment. So that's true for cancer, for high blood pressure, for heart disease, for diabetes. You might not know you have diabetes until 20 years you've been walking around with high blood sugar and you have an eye problem. And it's the first time it manifests itself. So it's exactly the same with mental health conditions. You might not know that you're depressed or that you're at the verge of burnout until you have a manifestation in the form of a physical ailment. So it's important to manage that physical ailment. If you have high blood pressure, yes, we want to treat the cause of the burnout, but let's get the blood pressure where it needs to be, and then we focus on the rest. So I think, mentioning all these signs and symptoms and manifestations, one thing we can do as individuals is be very cognizant, recognize the signs and symptoms of burnout, the signs and symptoms of our stressors. And once we do that, because everyone will have different, stressors, and different ways that they react to those stressors. So no two people will react the same way to a stressor, whether at work or at personal life. So once we identify the ones that trigger us, then the second step is to put a healthy sort of coping mechanism tied to that stressor. So if I know that every day at 10 p.m. I'm going to get a certain work email where I know it's going to cause me stress because it's asking me to do a lot of work that's for the rest of the month, and that's a regular process. What I can do is I can attach a coping mechanism to that where I say, okay, I know I'm going to get that email every day at 10. Before I open it, I'm going to go for a 5-minute walk to just decompress. So identifying those triggers and then attaching something that we can do to help deal with those triggers from a personal perspective, I think it's something that's helped me in the past, and something from a practical perspective we can think about.
And that's an interesting point you made, and I'm going to jump to the organization. So if organizations sort of, in the office, the workplace, you're getting that email at 10 o'clock or 10 p.m. And especially because your WPO is a global organization, International SOS is a global organization. There are multiple other global organizations. So getting that email at that crazy hour, it's coming, or early in the morning, and that's going to trigger that piece, right? To trigger that stress level in yourself. So it's good to understand from a individual's perspective of what can and how to identify that first, come to terms with it, and then figure out how we can sort of manage that going forward. But let's take a step back and look at the organization itself, right? So as an organization, how do we create a supportive environment to help prevent the burnout among employees? I mean, of course, to stop those 10 p.m. emails would be a nice start, but as an organization, what is it that we need to take into consideration? Because at the end of the day, it all sort of boils down to productivity. And if an individual is not productive, then it's not going to help the organization be successful. So what can an organization do? And Rod, you and I have worked on multiple with organizations as well. It'd be nice to sort of get your thoughts, and I'll start with you, Rod, and I'll hand over to Sam then, is what can organizations do? What is best look like for an organization, or good look like, forget best, but just good look like. And an example of where it's worked would be really nice to hear.
Yeah, so I think it's super important for the individual to have all the skills, the tools, the resources to know how to deal and cope with stressors in life. Um, but at the end of the day, if you think about it from, like, say, a fish bowl, like if you have a fish and it's in the most toxic water, it's dirty and has all these chemicals, and you're giving the fish, the best food on the market. I mean, it doesn't matter how good the food is. The fish at some point is gonna get sick because of the water is terrible. So you need to fix the water. So it's the same with the workplace. You can't have an individual and give them the best benefits, the best pay, whatever, in a toxic work environment and expect them to thrive. So there's a really good Forbes article that came out earlier this year that says uh, employee burnout is a leadership problem, not a workforce issue. No, I think it's a little bit of both. I think the individual has to develop those skill sets to recognize burnout in themselves, recognize it in others. So I think there is a part to play from an employee perspective, but the tools and the opportunities that employer actually has, I think, are far, far greater. So if we look at concepts like the new ISO standard on psychosocial safety that has recently come out, 45003, it looks at things like job demand, job control, the relationship between managers, employees. So those are things that we can implement from an organizational level. I think the manager bit is quite crucial. So employers have not historically trained managers to be good managers. And we have a statistic from the University of Manchester that says that 40% of managers actually have the right skills to be managers. They know how to talk to employees, they have empathy, they have good communication skills. Only 40%. The other 40% don't have those skills, but they're trainable. If you put them through a course, if you give them the skills, they will learn it. And 20% of managers out there should never be managers. They usually get there because they've worked in the company for 20 years. They got promoted, and then somebody one day said, you can now look after 20 people. And a lot of times they don't even like, being managers. It's just part of the career progression. So I think as an organization, we have to look at these concepts such as psychosocial safety that are relatively new. Look at upskilling managers to give them the right skill set, so they can be a support system for their employees. And if we start with that, I think we're off to a good path as an organization.
Thanks, Rod. And Isam, keeping Middle East in mind, I mean, what do you think, or rather, I think, what are the common causes of burnout within in the Middle East that you've sort of come across? Because we're talking about from a cultural perspective as well as regional, the conflict, of course, that we're noticing as well. What do you think from for the region itself then the organization, what can be done from an organization's perspective?
Yeah, before we head into that, I think just
Yeah.
following up on what Rodri said, I think the cost of burnout on organizations and employers is tremendously high. It's like hundreds of billions of dollars every year. So I think it's the importance of implementing the basics in terms of awareness and strategies for the organizations is actually a win-win situation for both the employees and the organizations. So there are many researchers go into the impact it has on productivity and production, on the quality, on the sick leaves and extended absences. So I think it's it's a central topic mainly in the Middle East. I think the most recent researches show that globally, including all of the world, I think 41% of the employees noticed signs of burnout. This number goes up to 52% in the Middle East. So we are almost 11 points higher than global in the Middle East. And it's really difficult to really point your finger on what's the main reason. I think it's a combination of different things. And Rodri has mentioned, when he said that, in the Western countries, we tend to separate the mind and body, and in the East, we tend to combine them. There are like similar comparisons to make with the workplace. I think there's a lot of stigma in the Middle East when it comes to mental health, when it comes to emotional support. Unfortunately, especially amongst men, and this information has been documented over the last several decades, and even though we are seeing an improvement, I think, in the last few years, there's still a lot of stigma around mental health. And when it comes to burnout, that's exactly what we're talking about, right? I think there's difference also in the way work ethics or work is perceived in the Middle East as opposed to other regions in the world. And this is not Middle East versus Western countries. I think there's more similarities, for example, in the work culture between the Middle East and Japan than there is between the Middle East and Europe, for example. The central place that the work has and takes in someone's life, and in Western countries, for example, there is a law that we call the right to disconnect. You were mentioning having an email at 10 p.m., right? So there's some laws, especially in France, for example, where your employer cannot expect you to connect to any of the platforms after a certain hour. That's the right to disconnect. I don't think there's any country in the Middle East who has this kind of standards actually being set. So that's also kind of one of the reasons why we see this increase in percentage in terms of employees noticing or having symptoms of burnout. I think we talked about the family as well, Nusrat. We touched really quickly on this one. I think depending on the industry, to be honest, and even within the Middle East, I think there are some differences between and disparities between the countries within the Middle East. I don't think there are a lot of common points, but there are some differences even from a legal standpoint. Like what's a full-time job, in this country as opposed to this country. I think in some industries, in some fields, work can be perceived as a tool and not necessarily the destination. Work is what helps you provide to your family. It's what's helped you. You're not necessarily seeking value in your work. It's you know, and I'm not overgeneralizing. Obviously, I'm just trying to put my finger on what's the main difference. And I think this would lead maybe to having Rodri mentioned mental distance from your work, from your duties and missions, and how much do you align with the company's values? How much do you align? How impactful do you perceive yourself as an employee and as part of the society? And I think these reasons might lead to a higher burnout rate. Again, not only the Middle East, but these are some key differentiators between, I think, the Middle East and other countries.
Now, do both of you think, I mean, that's a great, because I want to talk, I'm going to park the question about on the resources and the support that can be implemented, but I want to touch on the point of keeping that mental distance, right? So another term that's been around for some time that we've talked about and we've heard a lot about is work-life balance. Again, from a cultural perspective, work-life balance, what does that mean in the Middle East? Because majority of our time, especially if you're a working mom or a working dad, for that matter, or a single individual, majority of your life is spent your day is spent at work. How do you create that work-life balance? I'm sure individually it's going to be very different for different people, but what is that? How can we create that balance to prevent burnout? And is there a correlation between the two? Of course, I mean, I'm asking a leading question, but what can be done? I think from a cultural perspective, Isam, if we can address that, because in the Middle East, you have, and I'm saying Middle East, but then also I'm just looking at UAE because right now based in Dubai, there's a lot of expats in the country, in UAE itself. You have a lot of expat population coming in from different parts of the world. So how do you create that balance for individuals in in a culture where, like you said, very very similar to the Japanese culture, where you actually have to reply to your individual, your manager, at as soon as you get their email or a WhatsApp. I mean, that's the other thing, is this communication via WhatsApp, because that's another way to. So you send an email out, you get another WhatsApp from your manager saying, "Hey, I just sent you an email." So how again, organizations, how can we sort of, is it an education that we need to be providing to the organizations? What is it, what can be done to help manage that work-life balance for individuals?
Yeah, I think you're right when you're saying that. I think some of it must be covered by the organization, by the society, and by a huge shift in awareness regarding the topic, and some of it thankfully can be done on an individual level. I think individually what we should be doing is setting the right boundaries, right? I mean, again, I think even in each individual's journey and career, there are some times of your life where you actually want to be more dedicated to work. You have more time to dedicate to work. You have less external factors that would prevent you from being fully dedicated to work. So I think overall is setting the right boundaries in the right time of your life. You mentioned, young fathers and mothers might find it more, difficult for them to be as involved as they were when they were, I don't know, 19 years old, just fresh out of university and heading into the first work where you want to prove yourself as a good employee. So I think even individual boundaries change over time depending on where we are in our career. Um, Awareness is key. I think if the earlier you spot these symptoms, the faster you're going to be implementing some coping strategies, whether it's mindfulness strategies, whether it's CBT, cognitive behavior therapy tools that you can implement, physical exercise. The earlier you spot these, the more effective the intervention is going to be. And I think if the organization sets up the right standards, the right internal standard, if we actually train our staff on psychological first aid, if we are raising awareness is not only once a year when you have like a World Mental Health Day.
Right.
Raising awareness is having champions on the workplace, is having these marketing posters, emails being sent regularly. It's not, I think for organizations, it shouldn't be just a box you are ticking saying, hey, I spoke about burnout this year, move to next year. It's something you need to entertain, maintain throughout the whole year. Again, because the impact of burnout on the organization is extremely high. So that's why it is important. I was maybe I'll finish with this comment and head over to Rodri. I think in the Middle East, as opposed to other countries where might be perceived as more individualized, I think the Middle East is a more based on community, but based on it's a more of a group setting in the Middle East. The family has a high value and a high importance in the Middle East. It has its pros and cons, and I know what I'm talking about, but I think it's definitely one of the most valuable resources we have. Most of the employees who go through burnout or notice some early symptoms of burnout, the isolation has a big part in the Western countries, for example. Especially, and Roger, I agree, the management piece is extremely important. Some people actually don't really want to speak with their managers about burnout because they feel that their managers wouldn't approve of their situation. So sometimes we feel ourselves kind of isolated, not necessarily being able to speak with this with friends or with manager or with like a colleague. I think that there's where the social support actually comes in handy, especially in the Middle East. Being built around this model of society, I think is incredibly important. And I think it's a valuable resource. And I know for some people we want to separate just talking about work-life balance, and I think it's valid. We want to separate, work and personal life. Doesn't prevent you from actually trying to seek support when needed, among your family members.
Exactly, and we made this point, Isam, when we were doing our risk outlook earlier this year as well. Is about, the topic was one of the risks was burnout, and how important it was to actually educate and train managers to support their team. Again, to your point, Rod, managers who are not meant to be managers in that role, can you educate them? Can you train them if they are in that role? How do you support them to make sure they are able to support the employees in turn, and identify any sort of early signs? So I'll just, Rod, your thoughts on that work-life balance topic before we move on to the next part of the discussion.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird term because I mean, especially with with I think with a lockdown and introducing new ways of working where now everybody was connected um, through Teams calls and things like that. It just kind of completely wreaked havoc on the concept. So I think rather than being too prescriptive in saying, I know, for instance, work a lot in Scandinavian countries, and they are so good at just turning everything off at a certain time of the day and then just going home, and that's it. There's no sort of out of office type of calls and the rest. However, I don't think it's that simple because especially as we progress towards a more globalized world, you have to work with people if you're in a multinational that are on the other part of the globe. The other thing I've picked up is some individuals, they want or they need to look after care ones, kids
Mhm.
that might be sick, unexpected things, and then they want to do their work after hours, and that works better for them on that particular day. So I think some of the things that have come out of the research are it was something we already knew before the pandemic, and after the pandemic, it came out and it was the same findings, which is good because it meant that it was reinforcing what we understood, and that's the ability to for an individual to be flexible and be able to plan. So if you have an employee where they can actually plan their sort of their life, their work week, where they have the flexibility to adjust where needed, there
Yeah.
aren't many sort of real surprises. That is the most effective thing that an organization can do. The moment you start throwing curveballs and give them a new assignment that they have to deal with, for tomorrow, it throws everything off course, and that's when we start to see, stress and burnout. So organizations allowing flexibility, both as managers and as organizations, so that the person can use their own style of work um, to really set their times for work and life is really important. And the other thing is, as Isam said, the ability to set non-negotiables
Mm.
is so important, both work non-negotiables and personal non-negotiables. And it's not an easy task, but saying, I will not take this lunchtime hour to do anything but eat, my food. And the French, for instance, are really good at that. I worked in a hospital, and we had 2 hours in France for food, and it didn't matter if there was an emergency. You had those 2 hours on campus. And by the way, there was like chefs in the hospital, which was unbelievable. But anyway, they take their lunchtime very serious. And so I think equally, we need to find those non-negotiables where we won't budge. We prioritize both, again, from work and personal reasons. And for those of you who are in leadership positions, being the ones to do that will trigger a cultural shift where your employees see that you're walking the walk, and then they'll
Yeah.
feel more at ease in doing that. So there's a few great bosses I've had over the years where they've been excellent at being the first ones to say, okay, I'm leaving at this time, and now it's family time, and I don't expect you to contact me. I don't expect you to pick up if I call you at 10, but they're the first ones to do it. So really leading by example, I think, is another important way to manage those work-life balance type of issues.
And both of you, thank you very much. Great points, great information. So that's love that. Um, Now let's take moving forward from a resource. I want to really talk about support system that can be put in place, not at the organizational level, but Rod, as you mentioned, ISO has dedicated the new as the psychosocial assessment that's in place that they're recommending that organizations should implement or should use to assess the mental health of the employees. What is in place from a support perspective, Isam, in the Middle East? I'm using Middle East, of course, there are multiple countries in the Middle East, but do you think there's one country that's doing this better than the other? Not that we're comparing, but what is in place, what resources are available, and how do you sort of tap into them from your experience?
Yeah, yeah. I don't think it's about comparing the countries. It's really more toward the industries we're working in, the fields we are working in, and how easily can you implement some of the um, strategies. It's funny, Rod was mentioning the hospital setting, which is a great example of how tricky burnout can be. Most of the researches in the Middle East about burnout were actually conducted amongst like hospital
Very
workers,
true.
just
Yeah.
due to the extended amount of hours and the fact that there's always emergency, and it was a nice comparison. I think, Nusrat, we should think of it as what proactive measures we can implement as an organization, being part of our core values, what resources we can implement upfront as part of the benefits, and what reactive measures can we have once we have a situation. And obviously, being proactive will decrease the probability of having more employees getting toward burnout. So I think it really depends on, as an employee, do you want to implement an employee assistance program or a hotline or some mental health support line, call it whatever you want to call it, a place or line where employees can actually contact and speak with a mental health professional, gather a little bit more awareness, some psychoeducation, as I said, some mindfulness techniques, just to implement and try and uh, really live in the present, and really not necessarily we were talking about stress and anxiety and how it's related to previous events and potentially future events that might make you anxious, and mindfulness is what will bring you to the present and not necessarily being impacted by the past and the future. I think on an individual level, I think we need to work on setting the right example. As Rod said, we need to get rid of this stigma, and we're going there. We have more and more mental health professionals in the Middle East. I'm not saying it's easy to book an appointment with a mental health professional, don't get me wrong, but it's much less hard than it was 15 years ago, for example. So I think it's also removing this stigma ourselves, set the right examples for ourselves, for our colleagues, for our family members as well. Talk about it, explicitly talking about it. We have some organizations in the Middle East, due to the cultural stigma barrier, what they have done is that they have recorded videos of actual employees who actually got support from an EAP, an employee assistance program, from just seeking private support themselves. They did some videos. It actually normalizes what you're living, what you're going through. It's really a process of normalization, saying it is normal at some point to feel what you're feeling now, depending on the context. Like it's probable that in someone's life will be feeling what I have been feeling for 6 months. This is what I have done. I called this phone number. I booked an appointment. I spoke with my manager. The only item I haven't mentioned yet, because we're talking about individuals and organizations, and these are like the two extremes, right? It's like individual level and then like 10,000 employees level. I think there's a team piece as well. I think the team is important, and I know this is not necessarily applicable to everyone depending on what industry and are we part of a team.
Right.
But I think we can implement some what we call intervision, group supervision, talking groups, workshops within the team to actually seek this peer-to-peer support and a share of experience of how do I cope with a difficult situation? How do I set the right boundaries? And I love Rodri's comments about the non-negotiable. What's non-negotiable for me? Is it, can yours be the same as mine? And how can I learn from senior staff members? How can I learn from someone who's been there? So I think sharing success stories within the organization or across organizations is also key in terms of raising awareness.
No, thanks, Sam. That's really helpful. And like how you mentioned the industries, and absolutely, because you have the EPCs, especially in the region, you'll see a lot of EPC organizations who have been subcontracting. There's a lot of construction going on. Saudi is going through this huge influx. I mean, in the UAE, there's always construction going. There is that huge population, the worker population. So understanding how you support that particular population versus a corporate environment, how do you support these different environments is absolutely key. And coming up with a support system is going to be crucial, because you need to have that implemented at the organizational level. Even I think at the country level, if you can provide guidance to the companies and organizations and how to manage that, I think is really important. I am cognizant of aware of the conscious of time right here, but I want to ask one last question. Just on that same note, Rod, I'll end the session then. Before we jump on to the questions, is um, from your experience, and you've worked across the different regions with various clients, what have you sort of come across that has been able to create that someone's done a really stellar job in creating the mental health awareness within an organization? Because that again is the awareness piece is a stigma, leading with example. Anyone that you know, I mean, you don't have to name the organization, of course, but client that actually has done this really well and how it has worked positively for them?
Yeah, there's a few that come to mind, and they all seem to share the same um, elements, and that is that their CEOs have come out and started telling their personal stories around depression or anxiety or burnout. So there's a few great examples out there. So if you look at, there's a few financial institutions in the UK where, in January, there's this big meeting, Davos, where all the bigwigs go and, they talk about different global issues. There was one a few years ago when one of the CEOs of a banking firm came out, and it wasn't scripted. Nobody knew what he was going to say, and he talked about his depression and how he couldn't get out of bed, and his personal struggle with it. Equally, the Prime Minister of Norway, during his tenure, at one point came out and gave a press conference saying he had disappeared for the last month because he had severe depression. And if you look at the next things that happened, the next series of events that happened in Norway and with this particular multinational, it was amazing. The effect they had on the country, on the organization were so massive, in that everybody felt safe, like it was a safe space to talk about their own issues. There was then campaigns where people were invited to record 30-second snippets telling their own story in all parts of the world. So as Isam said, that part is essential when normalizing these conversations, and that cultural shift will take time, but we can get there. I always think of tobacco. So years ago, you could find ashtrays on airplanes, and it was normal. You could smoke doctors would smoke during consultations, and everyone thought it was, it's fine, it's normal. And if you would have told anybody that, smoking wouldn't be allowed indoors, they would have thought, there's no way that's going to happen. And different countries adopted, these measures at different paces. So if you look at Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, they all adopted these regulations on banning smoking indoors at their own speed. But if you look at today, there's no airline in the world where you would even think of, lighting a cigarette. And so I think that extreme shift in reality is absolutely possible, and I think part of it is leading with having the most senior individuals, or the people that are champions, even if they're not the CEO, but somebody that other individuals look up to in the organization. Them, talking about their own experience is kind of the first domino effect that we need to see to make this normal.
Great. Thank you so much. It was such a great session with both of you. The key points I think we need to take away: lead by example, absolutely. Make sure the managers are well aware of bringing about this change and aware of the session about mental health, about burnout, and how they can address it. you as an individual, making sure you have those boundary rights, creating those boundary lines for yourself as well. That's important. So thank you both of you. Really appreciate it. A very fascinating and a really needed session. And I'm going to jump to the questions that Lorraine has been kind enough to share over here. Um, there's one here. Let me just read this through. Can depression lead to burnout, or is it the other way around? And what can we do when we are not able to identify a stressor or a trigger, yet feel the symptoms of a burnout syndrome? Rod, do you want to give
Yeah,
that to you?
I can take that. So it's important to go back to the concept of burnout as a workplace related issue. And that's kind of the defining characteristic of it. So, of course, if somebody's depressed, that can put them at a higher risk or predispose them to lead to burnout. But it's also the other way around. If somebody experiences burnout, then they can be at high risk for then manifesting the clinical signs and symptoms leading to the diagnosis of depression as well. So it's a two-way street. So that's why it's so important that if you have an individual that has any pre-existing condition, you know, whether it's insomnia, for instance, that will make them more prone to other things, not just burnout, but you know, even diabetes. We know it affects your metabolism, your glucose intolerance if you don't get enough sleep. So all these things are sort of two-way streets. Sorry, there was what was the second part of the question?
The second part is, and what do we do when you're not able to identify a stress or a trigger, yet feel the symptoms of the burnout syndrome?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because how many of us are, you know, endocrine specialists, cardiovascular disease specialists to be able to identify, you know, early
Right.
signs of a heart attack? I mean, it's unlikely, you know, that's going to be the case. So I think there's a few ways. So one, you know, I mentioned those open sourced tools, surveys out there that are medical tools that, you know, anybody can fill out. There's apps out there that are free, where you can do assessments to look at your you know, clinical. They're not clinical tools, but they give you a good indication as to whether or not you should then go speak to a professional. And so they're just sort of, you know, thermometers or tools that we can use in-house, use ourselves, um, if you're not an expert. And then that can lead you to then go have a conversation with an expert, which is really a great way to actually figure out. So I would say, you know, keeping those things in mind is a good way to early identification of signs and symptoms.
And if I may add,
Yeah.
Rod, from a psychological support perspective, it's not necessarily a bad thing not having a triggering event. Obviously, some people, you know, would access mental support with a specific, you know, triggering situation that has happened, and you end up actually working on coping with the symptoms. It's not always. There's a tool that you can find easily with a quick search on internet. It's called the Beck Collins. It's the ABC exercise. It's a CBT exercise called ABC, where you would identify an activating event and then see what are the consequences that you're having. So emotional consequences, emotions you're feeling, physical symptoms. The majority of times, the symptoms are not based on the activating event. They are based on the beliefs you're having regarding that activating event. It's what you believe toward what has happened. So that's the ABC: A for activating events, B for beliefs, and C for consequences. So whether you have a triggering event or not, and whether you know where the symptoms come from, it's much more important to work on your beliefs toward these symptoms and toward what happened rather than the activating event itself. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's more about, are you willing to work on the symptoms and learn some coping strategies that can be helpful?
Okay. Thank you both. Next one is, apparently stress seems to be inherited or adapted, passed from one person to the other. Has the research found the cause of stress and ways to stop before it transforms into burnout? But as in cause of stress, the stresses, there's stressors, various types of stressors. So I don't know, either of you can take this one. I'm not sure who would be.
I can cover look at it from from a genetic medical perspective. With all chronic diseases, we say that there's two components to it. So there's the genetic component, which you can't change, and we all have inherited different predispositions for different diseases, but it doesn't necessarily mean we will develop them. What will determine if we develop them or not are life. So your habits, your environment, what you go through, that'll be the determining factor whether those things express themselves later in life. And that's true for heart disease, for cancer, etc. And it's the same for a lot of mental health related conditions. So we can be born with the predisposition. We know from science that some people are born with different parts of their brain, different sizes. We know that the activation of the amygdala is different, which is a part of the brain. Can be different in one person to the other, which might determine how emotional they are to certain events. We know that, for instance, it's been documented actually in science that a lot of the people that are very artistic, whether they're actors, painters, they do music, they have certain parts of the brain that are much more easily activated and respond at a much higher sort of response rate than to events or stimulations than somebody who isn't. So of course they will react, maybe different to somebody that doesn't have that predisposition. So again, it's not necessarily a case of whether if we're born with, if we have mother, father, grandparents all with depression, clinical diagnosis of depression, doesn't mean that we will develop it. It's how we live our lives and those habits that might make that condition express itself. So there's still debate in terms of the percentage attributed to each one. Some say that, say, cardiovascular disease, 40% of cases are preventable based on the genetic environment and so the genetics and the environment. But the fact of the matter is that doesn't mean we will develop it necessarily if we have it in our DNA.
That's true. Issam, anything from your end?
Yeah, just following up on that one. I mean, obviously Roger is covering the medical piece. So I mean, the way I would present things, and I think the best way to look at it is comparing stress and anxiety. We have this tendency of combining both every single time, stress and anxiety, like if it was one and only symptom.
Yeah.
But actually stress, and Rodri mentioned that very clearly, it's a medical stress is more like it's a hormonal response to a stressor. Your head. Can you hear me all right?
We just lost you for 2 seconds. We heard you just now, Issam.
Yeah,
can you hear
me?
Yeah, now it's fine.
Yeah. So, and sorry, the stress is a response to a situation you're actually encountering, while anxiety is actually being worried or afraid about something that might happen in the future. So it's not the same thing at all. Stress is present. Stress is now facing a situation, where anxiety is more toward the future. You're actually, as a parent, if we're talking about the genetic piece, you're more likely to transmit your anxious personality than it is stress, right? I think that's the nuance that we have to separate between stress and anxiety. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. We have a minute, so I think it's a good time to wrap it up rather than take there are a few more questions, and actually there are quite a few questions. What we can do is maybe we can take those questions down, and I'll circulate it to both Issam, you and Rod. If you can provide your answers, we can share it with the audience once we're done. But I want to take the opportunity again. Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure to be a part of moderate this session with both of you, and hopefully we look forward to some other another session where we talk about different topics related to mental health, depression. Maybe it could be a topic because that's, I think, it started a bigger discussion than we talked about. But thank you. Any closing remarks or anything else from your end?
Well, thank you
Wonderful.
for facilitating this, Nusrat.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you very
Mr.
much. Thanks, Rod. Thanks, Assam. Take care. Thank you, everyone, for joining the session. Thank you. Bye-bye.